This is Happy Wheels Cars and Stuff, and today I'm going to be walking you through a F-150 full suspension replacement. So let's get started. The following is going to be a list of tools you'll need for each thing you're trying to do. The first is going to be for the upper control arm tools, the next is going to be for the strut replacement tools, and the last is going to be the lower control arm mounting bolts and ball joint tools. Feel free to click on the timestamp in the video that correlates to the job you're trying to do. It'll make it go by a little bit quicker for you. Start out by removing the hubcap, if you have one, and breaking torque on your car's lug nuts. If needed, put a metal tube around the breaker bar for added leverage. If the tire moves too much when breaking torque, put a chock behind it or in front of it to stop it from moving. If the lug nuts are still giving you trouble, spray penetrating fluid around them and let them sit before you try again. When the lug nuts break loose, it should sound something like this. Now raise the truck and set it on jack stands. Then fully remove the lug nuts and the tire, and then set the tire under the frame for extra safety. Next, spray the parts to be removed with penetrating fluid. Lower the jack from the frame and raise it up under the lower control arm enough to support it. Now remove the upper control arm nut using a 21mm socket. Once the nut's removed, hand thread it back on about halfway. Then hammer the side of the spindle until the upper control arm breaks loose, and then fully remove the upper control arm from the spindle. This next part isn't necessary, but I like to tie the spindle to the frame for convenience of moving the spindle out of the way of where I'm working and also to keep it from possibly snapping any cabling or lines. Moving on to the wheel well liner, you'll be removing these four 5.5mm bolts, two 10mm bolts. I know, the 5.5mm is kind of a weird size, but that's the size they are. Now pull out the liner from where it sits, but do not remove it yet. You'll need to pop out a connector from the inside of the liner as shown, and then you can fully remove the liner and then set it to the side. Separate the cables and the lines from each other, and then you can move on to the upper control arm mounting bolts. Remove the nuts using a 21mm socket and a crescent wrench to hold the bolts in place. Don't remove the bolts yet, just the nuts for now. Moving on to the caliper bracket, remove the two bolts by breaking them loose and then fully removing using a 3/4 inch socket. Before fully removing the caliper from the rotor, place a jack stand nearby to place the caliper onto, or use a bungee cord to hang the caliper from the frame. Remove the caliper from the rotor and set it out of the way. Next, move on to the lower strut bolt and nut. Use a crescent wrench to hold the bolt in place and remove the nut using a 24mm socket. Once the nut is off, you may have to tap out the bolt using a punch of some kind. Then, loosen and remove the three 17mm top strut mount nuts from the upper tower. Nuts are removed, you can remove the strut from the tower. As a side note, you may be able to remove the upper control arm bolts without removing the strut if there is enough room to do so. Now fully remove the upper control arm bolts from the mounts and remove the upper control arm from the truck. Once the upper control arm is out of the way, either one removed completely or propped up, remove the strut from the truck. Next, you're going to want to clean the strut tower areas. Before installing the new upper control arm, be sure it is oriented the same as the old one as shown. Now go ahead and install the upper control arm. If you have an aftermarket upper control arm with stiffer bushings, you may have to tap it into place with a mallet or pry it using a flat tip to line up the bolt holes. Once the holes are lined up, go ahead and insert the bolts and then tighten the nuts on. he had to remove the strut for upper control arm installation, then put the strut back into place and secure it with one top nut while aligning the bottom mounting hole. Once the bottom holes are aligned, insert the bolt, tapping as necessary to punch it through, and then tighten the nut onto it. Once this is secured, raise the lower control arm until the strut top mount is flush with the strut tower. Then fully tighten all 3 nuts. Depending on the way you tighten these nuts, it may take some time. Moving on to the spindle, start by removing the rotor. If you're lucky, it'll come right off. If not, however, you will have to try one of the following techniques to remove it, either tapping with a hammer or spraying penetrating fluid. Now remove the axle nut and set to the side. Before moving further, remove the vacuum line behind the bearing hub and set it to the side. Also, while you're at it, remove the ABS cable as shown, and then wrap it around the wheel bearing assembly. Moving on to removing the tie rod, you'll have to remove the cotter pin before removing the nut. Once the cotter pin is out, remove the nut using a 21mm socket. Then thread the nut on a few threads before moving on to tapping the spindle to break the tie rod free. If tapping on the side of the tie rod isn't working for you, you can always try tapping from the top. Once the tie rod breaks loose, remove the nut and then move the tie rod out of the way. Moving on to the end link, remove the top nut and lower nut using a 19mm socket or wrench and a crescent wrench to hold the end link in place. You may need to use a breaker bar for the lower nut. If you have any issues removing the end link nuts like I did, you may have to cut the end link. I recommend cutting at the following positions. If you do need to cut the end link off, please be sure to wear safety glasses at least. With the end link removed, maneuver the spindle in a way that will allow you to pull the axle away from it. Now, spray some more penetrating fluid on the lower ball joint nut, break it loose, and then remove it using a 24mm socket. Thread the nut back on a few threads and then begin whacking the side of the spindle until the spindle breaks loose from the ball joint. Once separated from the ball joint, remove the nut and take the spindle away from the truck. With the spindle fully removed, spray the top of the ball joint with penetrating fluid and remove the snap ring using snap ring pliers as shown. With the snap ring removed, use your ball joint service kit to press out the ball joint from the LCA as shown. You may hear some popping while doing this, and that is completely normal when pressing out and pressing in a ball joint. With the ball joint removed, clean the area to prep for the new ball joint pressing. Then press in the new ball joint using the ball joint service kit as shown. Make sure that the ball joint is lined up well with the hole while you're pressing, otherwise it may press in at a bad angle. Once the ball joint is fully seated, set the snap ring in place. Moving on to the LCA removal, loosen the mounting bolts and nuts using a 22mm socket and crescent wrench as shown. I have a caster kit, so my mounting nuts may look different than the stock ones. Remove the mounting nuts and leave the bolts in place for now. Having the jack supporting the LCA, remove the lower strut bolt and nut using a 24mm socket and wrench. Once removed, let the LCA hang from the mounting bolts. Now fully remove the mounting bolts and then remove the LCA from the truck. Before moving on, you may want to clean the suspension components and mounting points since they are all exposed already. After cleaning the CV axle, you will need to re-grease with a heavy-duty grease prior to reinstalling, and I will get to that later in the video. Once the area is cleaned up, make sure the new LCA is in the same orientation as the old one, and then install it the reverse way you removed the old one. When reinstalling the Endlink, you will want to leave the lower strut bolt off to make it easier to maneuver the Endlink in place, then install the rest of the way as shown. But don't tighten the nuts just yet. Now continuing on with the LCA install, starting with the lower strut bolt, make sure to torque the bolt down to 351 foot-pounds. Once the mounting bolts and nuts are in place, be sure to torque them down to 222 foot-pounds. Now fully tighten the upper and lower Endlink nuts. Before reinstalling your spindle, go ahead and clean it up. When you're finished cleaning the hub area and the back of the spindle, you will need to re-grease inside the hub using heavy-duty grease as shown, being liberal with the amount you use. More doesn't hurt. After greasing the hub, be sure to grease the CV axle as well. With the components cleaned and re-greased, reattach the spindle to the LCA, tighten the nut all the way, and reinsert the CV axle. Next, hand tighten the axle nut before moving on. Tighten the tie rod to the spindle with the castle nut, being sure to leave the opening exposed to be able to insert the cotter pin as shown. Now, torque the UCA mounting bolts to 111 foot-pounds. The UCA bolts are torqued to spec. Attach the UCA to the spindle, tighten the ball joint nut, and then torque it down to 85 foot-pounds. Then, fully tighten the axle nut using a ratchet and socket, making sure not to torque to spec due to the possibility of snapping the axle bolt. Ask me how I know. Torque the lower ball joint nut to 111 foot-pounds. Unwind the ABS cable from the wheel bearing and set to the side for now. Now clean the caliper and rotor prior to moving on. Once they're cleaned, reinstall the rotor and caliper as shown, torquing the caliper mounting bolts to 148 foot-pounds. Once the rotor and caliper are in place, reattach the lines, connectors, and cables, then reinstall the wheel well liner reverse of the way you removed it. With the liner installed and everything reconnected, lift the truck off of the stands with the jack, remove the stands, reattach the tire, and tighten the lug nuts in a star pattern. The lugs back on, lower the truck, and then torque the lug nuts down in a star pattern. After that, your work is complete. Thank you everybody for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to like it and leave your comments in the comment section below. If you want to subscribe, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and that bell to be notified whenever I have new content. In the meantime, enjoy one of the videos in the top left or right. Have a good one.